Before factories, before fast fashion, before everything was disposable. There were women who saved every scrap of fabric, every worn-out shirt, every faded dress, and turned them into something that would last 100 years. Tonight, we follow the needle and thread through 2 centuries of American life. If you're new here, welcome. Threads of Time is your place to drift off to the quiet corners of history, stories told slowly, softly, just for sleep. Hit subscribe and the bell, so these stories find you every time. There is something about the oldest things that carry a kind of quiet weight. Not the weight of burden, but the weight of time. The way a river stone fits perfectly in the palm of your hand because water has been smoothing it for thousands of years. That is the feeling of holding a colonial American quilt. If you were ever lucky enough to stand in a museum or a historic home and look down into a glass case at one of these early pieces, the colors faded to the softest imaginable versions of themselves, the stitching small and even and impossibly patient, you might feel something shift inside you, a kind of recognition, a kind of reverence. Because what you are looking at is not just a blanket. You are looking at a decision. You are looking at hundreds and hundreds of tiny decisions, made by a pair of hands that understood, in a way we have largely forgotten, that nothing should be wasted, that everything has a second life. That beauty is not something you buy. It is something you make, slowly, from whatever you have. The story of American quilting begins long before the United States was a country. In the years when the eastern edge of North America was still a collection of struggling settlements clinging to the coastline, surrounded by wilderness that stretched farther than anyone fully understood. These were not comfortable places. The winters were brutal in ways that are genuinely difficult to imagine now. In a world of central heating and insulated walls and synthetic down comforters ordered to your door in 2 days. In those early settlements, warmth was a matter of survival, not comfort. The line between having enough and not having enough was drawn in very practical terms: food in the root cellar, wood stacked by the door, and fabric, always fabric. Because without enough of it, you could not keep your family from the cold. Fabric was precious in colonial America in a way that modern life has made nearly incomprehensible to us. We live in an era of extraordinary textile abundance. Clothing is so inexpensive and so available that we throw it away, donate it, leave it in bags on street corners without much thought. We buy things, wear them a few times, and move on. But in the 17th and early 18th centuries, fabric was expensive, difficult to obtain, and time-consuming to produce. Wool had to be shorn, cleaned, carded, spun, and woven before it became cloth. Linen came from flax, which had to be grown, harvested, retted, broken, scutched, hackled, spun, and woven, a process so long and labor-intensive that simply listing the steps takes your breath away. Cotton, before the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, was even more difficult to process. And imported cloth, the finished linens and woolens and silks that came on ships from England, was taxed and costly and not always available, especially as tensions with Britain grew through the 18th century. In this context, a piece of fabric, even a worn piece, even a stained or torn or thinning piece, was not something a colonial woman threw away. It was something she saved. She saved the worn elbows cut from otherwise usable shirt fabric. She saved the hems of dresses her daughters had outgrown. She saved the backs of waistcoats that had worn through at the front. She saved the unfrayed portions of curtains that had finally given up at the edges. She kept these pieces in bags and baskets, sorted sometimes by color or weight, the textile equivalent of a kitchen that wastes nothing, where the bones become broth and the stale bread becomes stuffing and everything has somewhere left to go. And from these saved pieces, these fragments and remnants and carefully preserved scraps, she made quilts. The earliest American quilts were not primarily artistic objects. That came later, and it came gradually, and it came because of something deeply and wonderfully human, the way that people, given any task at all, will eventually begin to ask not just how to do it, but how to do it beautifully. But in the beginning, The driving force was simply warmth. A quilt is, at its most basic, a sandwich of layers. A top layer of pieced or whole cloth, a middle layer of batting or wadding for insulation, and a back layer of plain fabric, all held together, with stitching. The stitching is what makes it a quilt rather than just a layered blanket, and that layered, stitched construction is remarkably effective at trapping warm air close to the body. A well-made quilt, even a simple one, could mean the difference between sleeping through a winter night and lying awake shivering in the dark. So women made them. They made them constantly. A household needed many quilts for every bed, quilts to hang over doorways and drafty windows, quilts to wrap around children going out into the cold, quilts to layer on top of one another when January arrived, in earnest. And because the fabric for these quilts came from whatever was at hand, the earliest American quilts were by necessity a kind of textile record of family life. A shirt worn by a husband until it could be worn no longer found itself, reborn in the backing of a child's bed quilt. A dress that had been made for a wedding and then altered and let out and taken in and worn for 20 years of Sundays until it simply could not be mended again. The good parts of that dress lived on in the top of a quilt that might cover the grandchildren of the woman who had worn it. There is a word for this kind of reuse. This understanding that objects have lives that can continue even after their original purpose has been exhausted. The word is thrift, though that word has shrunk in our modern usage to mean something primarily about money. But in the colonial sense, thrift was a whole philosophy. It was an understanding of the world as a place where resources were finite and precious, where waste was not just economically foolish but morally questionable. A thrifty woman was an admirable woman. A woman who wasted fabric was a woman who had not understood what life required of her. And yet, and this is the thing that moves me most about this history, within the severe constraints of necessity, within the strict logic of waste nothing and use everything, something else was also happening. The women who pieced together those early quilts were making choices. They were choosing which piece went next to which. They were noticing that the deep blue of an old coat looked striking against the warm rust of a worn apron. They were finding that triangles, cut from corners and odd angles, could be arranged into shapes that suggested stars or pinwheels or flying geese moving across the sky. They were discovering, in other words, that the constraints of their material did not prevent beauty, that beauty could be found within those constraints, that limitation itself could be a kind of creative discipline. This is one of the oldest stories in art. It is the story of the sonnet with its strict rules of meter and rhyme that somehow, far from preventing expression, seem to intensify it. It is the story of the haiku, 17 syllables that manage to hold entire landscapes and entire human experiences. And it is the story of the colonial American quilt, made from nothing more than the worn-out remnants of ordinary domestic life, stitched together by firelight or by the thin gray light of a winter afternoon, and emerging as something that is, genuinely beautiful. The patterns these early quilters used were not invented in America. Quilting itself is an ancient technique, found across many cultures and many centuries, and the women who came to the American colonies brought with them the textile traditions of England, the Netherlands, Germany, and other parts of Europe. English quilts of the 17th century had their own conventions and patterns, and these traveled across the Atlantic in the memories and hands of the women who emigrated. But what happened in America was something new. The particular combination of scarcity, diversity of available fabrics, and the practical reality of colonial life began to push American quilting in its own direction. Because the fabrics available to colonial American quilters were so varied, different weights, different weaves, different colors, different degrees of wear. The pieced quilt became more common in America than in England, where whole cloth quilts made from a single piece of uncut fabric, quilted in elaborate stitched patterns, were more fashionable among those who could afford them. A whole cloth quilt requires enough fabric of a single type to cover an entire bed top, a significant investment. A pieced quilt requires only that you have enough small pieces of fabric, which a colonial household almost always did. The pieced quilt was, in a sense, the democratic form. It asked nothing of you except patience and ingenuity and the willingness to look at a pile of scraps and see something other than what they had been. Patience. That word deserves to sit for a moment. Because the other thing we must understand about these early quilts is the sheer amount of time they required. Cutting hundreds of small pieces of fabric by hand, with scissors and templates made, from paper or thin wood. Sewing those pieces together by hand, one seam at a time, with thread that had itself been spun and might need to be spun again before the project was finished. Laying out the batting, stitching the layers together, and for the quilting itself, the small, even stitches that passed through all 3 layers and held the whole thing together. The ideal was stitches so small and even that you could not tell the front from the back. 20 stitches to the inch was considered excellent work. Women practiced this from childhood. Girls learned to sew almost as soon as their fingers were steady enough to hold a needle, and they practiced on quilts, making small samples in doll quilts and contributing squares to family projects before they were trusted with a full-sized piece on their own. Time was something colonial women both had and didn't have. They had long evenings, especially in winter when outdoor work was impossible, and the household gathered around the fire. Candles and firelight were expensive and valuable, but the hands could be kept busy in ways that needed little light. Spinning, knitting, sewing, and so the quilt progressed, piece by piece, evening by evening, through the long months of the year. But colonial women also worked extraordinarily hard during the daylight hours. Cooking, cleaning, preserving food, tending gardens, caring for children and animals, managing the entire domestic economy of a household. The quilting came in the margins of this labor. It came at the end of the day when the other work was done, or on the quiet Sunday afternoons that were perhaps the only real rest a colonial woman knew. And it came in company. Because one of the great practical realities of quilting is that some of the work, particularly the final step of quilting the layers together, goes much faster with many hands. A quilt frame set up in a large room could accommodate 6, 8, 10 women sitting around it, each working on a section, stitching toward the center as the frame was rolled in from the edges. This was the quilting bee, and we will return to it in more detail in a later chapter. But even here in the very beginning it matters, because the social dimension of quilting was not separate from its practical dimension. They were woven together from the start. Women brought their scraps to one another's houses. They shared patterns and techniques. They helped one another meet the deadlines that life imposed. A daughter getting married, a baby coming, a son setting off to make his own home somewhere further west and needing warmth to take with him. The quilts made in these first colonial decades were, many of them, entirely humble objects. They were not made to be preserved. They were made to be used, and they were used until they fell apart. And when they fell apart, the still usable pieces were saved and used again. This is one reason so few early American quilts survive. The ones that do tend to be the ones that were special enough to be saved from daily use. The bridal quilt, the quilt made for an important occasion, the quilt that someone thought beautiful enough to keep rather than use. And so the history we can actually see, the history preserved in museums and private collections, is somewhat skewed toward the remarkable. The ordinary quilts, the everyday quilts, the quilts that kept families warm through dozens of winters and were finally worn to nothing and composted back into the earth. Those are mostly gone, but their legacy is not gone. Their legacy is in every quilt made after them, every pattern that was passed down, taught from mother to daughter to granddaughter to great-granddaughter, every technique refined over generations of practice, every philosophy of thrift and creativity, and patience and care that shaped the way American women approached the making of things. The first stitch was made from necessity. But necessity, in the hands of women who were paying attention, who were caring about their work, who were finding in it not just utility but expression, became something more. It became a tradition. It became an art form. It became, over 200 years and counting, one of the most distinctly American ways of making something beautiful out of the ordinary materials of an ordinary life. And if you could hold one of those early quilts tonight, feel the weight of it, the slight unevenness of the old fabric, the tiny stitches holding everything together, you might understand something that is hard to put into words. That the women who made these things were not so different from you. They were tired at the end of their days. They had worries and losses and hopes and small daily joys. And they sat down in the quiet margin of their lives, and they made something. From almost nothing, they made something that lasted. Rest now. Let the thread go still. There is a particular quality of sound that belongs to a room full of women working. It is not loud. It is not the sound of a crowd or a celebration, though there is warmth in it, and sometimes laughter. It is more like the sound of a river moving at an easy pace, a continuous, layered, unhurried murmur that fills the space without overwhelming it. Voices rising and falling, the occasional pause, the sound of someone thinking before she speaks, and then speaking, and then the sound of others listening. It is one of the most human sounds there is, and for a long stretch of American history, one of the few places you could reliably hear it was gathered around a quilting frame, a group of women, needles in hand, heads bent over fabric, talking. We tend to think of history as something that happens in public, in meeting halls and courthouses and battlefields and the chambers where laws are made. We think of it as something spoken by people who were given permission to speak, by their rank, their education, their gender, their wealth. And for most of recorded American history, the people most reliably given that permission were men. Men debated in the Continental Congress. Men preached from pulpits. Men argued in taverns and coffee houses and on the floors of state legislatures. Men wrote the newspapers and the pamphlets and the letters that got saved and archived and taught. In schools 200 years later, the record of history for a very long time was largely the record of what men thought and said and decided. And so the quilting bee exists in an interesting relationship with that official record. It was not official. It was not public. It was not written down, not transcribed, not preserved in archives in any direct way. The conversations that happened around a quilting frame in a farmhouse in Pennsylvania in 1790, or in a frontier cabin in Ohio in 1830, or in a church hall in Georgia in 1865, those conversations are gone. The words themselves dissolved into the air the moment they were spoken, just as all spoken words do, and no one thought to record them because no one considered them the kind of thing worth recording. They were just women talking, just neighbors, gathered around a frame, stitching a quilt together, passing the time. But of course they were not just that. They were never just that. And the more carefully you look at the history of the quilting bee, at the accounts that do survive, the diaries and letters and later oral histories, the occasional newspaper notice or church record, the more clearly you can see that this was a space of genuine and sometimes radical significance, that the room full of women working was also a room full of women thinking, that the murmur of voices over a quilting frame carried information and opinion and grief and solidarity and sometimes outright rebellion, that the quilting bee was, in its quiet way, one of the most important institutions in American women's lives for more than 200 years. To understand why, you have to understand how constrained those lives were in other respects. A colonial or early American woman, and we are talking about white women here primarily because the experiences of enslaved women and free black women were different in ways we will come to, existed within a set of social and legal boundaries that were almost total. She could not vote. She could not own property once she was married, in most places and for most of this period. She could not sign contracts or conduct business in her own name. She could not attend the universities that were being built and endowed all around her. She could not speak in most public religious assemblies. She could not stand up in the town meeting and say what she thought. Her legal existence, in the famous phrase of the English jurist William Blackstone, was subsumed into that of her husband. Upon marriage, she became, in the eyes of the law, part of him rather than a separate person with separate rights. This was the world. Most women in early America accepted it not because they were passive or incapable of thought, but because the alternatives were essentially non-existent, and because the culture they lived in had constructed elaborate justifications for these, arrangements that were woven into religion and custom and social expectation in ways that were very difficult to untangle. You believed what everyone around you believed and what the preacher said on Sunday and what your mother had believed before you and what your daughters would believe after. The frame was total. And yet, people find ways. People always find ways. And one of the ways that American women found, over and over across the decades and the centuries, was the gathering. The occasion that required them to come together, that was sanctioned by the culture because it was productive and domestic and not threatening in any obvious way, that gave them hours, sometimes a full day, sometimes more, in one another's company, away from the oversight of husbands and fathers talking. The i.e., quilting bee was one of these occasions. There were others, the corn husking, the apple paring, the spinning bee, but the quilting bee was perhaps the most enduring and the most widespread, because quilts were always needed, and the final step of quilting the layers together genuinely went faster with many hands. There was a practical justification for the gathering that no one could argue with, and under the cover of that practical justification, something else could happen. What happened was conversation. Real conversation. The kind that matters. The kind that actually moves through a person and changes things. When women gathered at a quilting frame, they talked about their lives in ways they could not talk about them anywhere else. They talked about their marriages, with a frankness that would have been impossible in mixed company. They talked about childbirth and the fear of it, about the babies they had lost, about the physical realities of their bodies that the culture around them preferred not to acknowledge. They talked about difficult husbands and demanding mothers-in-law and neighbors who would behave badly. They talked about money, the perpetual grinding anxiety of money in households where there was never quite enough, and the woman of the house was expected to manage the gap between what there was and what was needed through sheer ingenuity. They talked about community news and who was sick, who had died, who had a new baby, who was struggling and might need help. This was not gossip in the dismissive sense we sometimes mean that word. This was information management. In communities spread across large distances with no telephone and unreliable mail, the periodic gathering of women was one of the primary ways that news traveled and that needs were identified. If a woman mentioned at the quilting bee that her neighbor had been ill for 3 weeks and her husband was unable to manage the farm alone, something would be done about it before the day was over. Help would be organized. Food would be brought. The community would respond, and it would respond because the women had talked. They also talked about ideas. This is perhaps the part that is hardest for us to fully appreciate, because we live in a world saturated with ideas, with books and articles and podcasts and conversations available to us in almost unlimited quantity. But for an early American woman with limited access to formal education, limited access to reading material beyond perhaps a Bible and an almanac, and limited opportunity for intellectual exchange outside the domestic sphere, the quilting bee was sometimes the most stimulating mental environment she encountered. Women brought things they had heard or read or thought about. They argued, gently. The social conventions of the gathering required a certain smoothness, a certain care for the feelings of others, but they argued nonetheless. About religion, about child rearing, about the right way to manage a household, or a farm. About events in the wider world that filtered into their lives through husbands and brothers and the occasional newspaper. And increasingly, as the 18th century became the 19th and the 19th century moved toward its great crises, they talked about politics, about the things happening in the world that affected their lives, even though they had no official voice in determining them. The quilting bee became, in some communities and some periods, a genuinely politicized space. During the Revolutionary era, when colonial women organized boycotts of British goods and began spinning and weaving their own cloth as a form of political protest, the spinning bee and the quilting bee became explicitly political acts. Women who gathered to make American cloth with American hands were making a statement, and they knew it. And the newspapers of the period, written by men, occasionally acknowledged it with a mixture of admiration and condescension. In the decades before the Civil War, the quilting bee in many northern communities became a space where abolitionist sentiment was expressed and organized. Women who supported the anti-slavery movement were often deeply involved in the network of church and community gatherings that included quilting bees, and the conversations at those frames carried abolitionist ideas in ways that were simultaneously public, because many people attended these gatherings, and private, in the sense that they were not official and not recorded, and happened below the threshold of what the official culture noticed or responded to. The quilt itself sometimes carried anti-slavery messages, in patterns chosen deliberately, in blocks made and donated to be sold at anti-slavery fairs, in the quiet symbolism of certain colors and arrangements. For enslaved black women in the South, the quilting bee existed in an entirely different register, one of both greater danger and, in some ways, even greater necessity. Enslaved people were, by the logic of the system that held them, not supposed to have interior lives, not supposed to form communities of their own, not supposed to talk among themselves in ways that the enslaver could not monitor and control. And yet they did. They found ways, as people always find ways, to gather and to talk and to maintain the human connections that the system was designed to destroy. Quilting was one of those ways. Enslaved women gathered in the quarters in the evenings, or on Sundays, or in whatever margins the brutal schedule of enslaved labor allowed, and they made quilts and they talked. They preserved African textile traditions in the designs they chose. Some historians argue that certain quilt patterns used by enslaved women reflect West African design principles, carried across the ocean in memory and remade in American fabric. They passed information, they maintained community. They told stories. The theory, and it remains a theory contested among historians, supported by oral history traditions but difficult to document definitively, that certain quilt patterns served as signals along the Underground Railroad, guiding freedom seekers through safe routes, fits into this larger picture of the quilt as a form of communication operating below the surface of what the dominant culture could see or read. Whether or not the specific code theory is accurate in all its details, the underlying truth it points to is real. That black women used quilting as a space for meaning-making and community building and resistance in a world that was trying to deny them all three. As the 19th century progressed and the situation of American women slowly, haltingly began to change, as some educational opportunities opened, as the suffrage movement built momentum, as more public roles became available, the quilting bee evolved alongside these changes. It did not disappear. It became something slightly different. In some communities, it became less a practical necessity and more a cherished social institution, maintained, not because women had no other way to get quilts made, but because the gathering itself was valued. Because women understood, even as their options expanded, that there was something irreplaceable about the particular quality of conversation that happened in that room, around that frame, with those needles moving and those hands busy and the quilt slowly taking shape in the center of the circle. There is something about working with your hands that opens a particular channel in the mind and the mouth. Anyone who has ever had a long conversation while driving or while cooking or while walking knows this phenomenon. The way that having your hands or your body occupied with a task that doesn't require your full attention somehow frees something in the mind, allows thoughts and feelings to surface that might not emerge in a more formal or static setting. The quilting bee understood this intuitively centuries before anyone had the psychological vocabulary to describe it. The needle and thread gave the hand something to do. The eyes could look at the work rather than at the person speaking. There was a rhythm to the stitching that was itself calming, that created a kind of background steadiness against which difficult things could be said. And difficult things were said. Women told the truth at quilting bees, in ways they could not tell it elsewhere. They told the truth about fear and loneliness and the weight of the lives they were living. They told the truth about joy, too, about what gave them pleasure, about the quiet satisfactions of work done well, about the things they loved. They gave and received comfort. They witnessed one another. That word, witness, is important here. To be witnessed means to have someone see you as you actually are, to have your reality confirmed by another person's attention and acknowledgement. For women who spent much of their lives in roles that required the subordination of the self, wife, mother, daughter, helper, caretaker, to be witnessed, even in the informal and unrecorded way of a quilting bee conversation, was a gift of real significance. The quilt that came out of the bee was always more than the sum of its fabric and thread. It was stitched through with the conversation that had accompanied its making. The woman who slept under it would perhaps not know in any explicit way that it had been made in a room full of talking and laughter and sometimes tears, in a room where women had been honest with one another for a few precious hours. But the warmth of it would be real. the care of it would be real. The hours of attention that had gone into every small stitch, that would be real, and would last. And the quilt would carry it forward through years and decades in the way that made objects made by many hands feel different from objects made by one. The quilting bee is not, it should be said, entirely a thing of the past. Quilting guilds and groups and bees still meet all across America, in church halls and community centers and living rooms, around frames both traditional and improvised. The demographics have shifted. The necessity that drove the original gatherings is gone. But something of the original spirit remains. Women and men and people of all kinds gather to work on quilts together and to talk. The needle still seems to open that particular channel. The shared work still creates the particular quality of honesty that comes when the hands are busy and the eyes can rest on the fabric rather than on the face of the person speaking. What they are doing, whether they know it or not, is continuing, something very old. They are keeping open a space that women fought to create, in the margins of lives that did not always leave much margin. A space that was, for so long, one of the only spaces available. A space where the murmur of voices could rise and fall and say what needed to be said, while outside the window the world went on in its official, recorded, loudly documented way, and inside, around the frame, the real history was being made. One small stitch, one quiet word at a time. Let the voices settle now. Let the room go still. You are held. There is a language older than words that lives in pattern. You find it everywhere, once you begin to look. In the way a culture decorates its pottery, embroiders its clothing, carves its door frames, lays its floors. Pattern is one of the first things human beings reach for when they want to say something that ordinary language cannot quite hold. Something about the repeating shape, the deliberate arrangement, the choice of this color next to that one. It carries meaning in a way that bypasses the analytical mind and goes somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere that recognizes significance before it can explain it. The women who made American quilts understood this, though they might not have described it in these terms. They understood it the way you understand things that have been true for so long they feel like instinct. They understood it in their hands and the choices they made when they sat down with their fabric and their templates and began to decide what this quilt would say. Because quilts did say things. This is perhaps the most important and the most underappreciated fact about American quilt history, that the patterns were not merely decorative, not merely the aesthetic preferences of individual makers, but a kind of vocabulary, a shared, visual language that communities developed over generations that was taught and learned and passed down and adapted and argued over, that carried within its repeating shapes and careful color choices a weight of meaning that the people who made and used these quilts understood completely even when they never spoke it aloud. You did not need to explain to a woman in a 19th century American farming community what it meant when a bride received a quilt in the double wedding ring pattern, or when a mourning quilt appeared in shades of black and gray and purple, or when a church congregation pieced together a quilt in the Star of Bethlehem. The meaning was already there, already known, already part of the shared understanding that held the community together. To enter this language, to begin to read it, you have to start with the simplest and most elemental fact about quilt patterns, which is that they are made of geometry, squares and triangles and rectangles and hexagons and circles. These are the basic units from which the entire elaborate vocabulary of American quilting is built. And geometry, it turns out, is remarkably expressive. The triangle can become an arrow, a wing, a tooth, a flying bird, a mountain peak. The square can become a window, a field, a stepping stone, a grave marker. The way you put these shapes together, the rhythm of their repetition, the colors you choose for each element, the scale at which you work, determines entirely what the pattern means and feels. A quilt made of large, bold shapes in high contrast. Colors feels completely different from one made of tiny, intricate pieces and subtle gradations of a single hue. Even if both are technically versions of the same basic pattern, the geometry is the same, the meaning is not. The names given to quilt patterns are themselves a kind of poetry, and they tell you a great deal about the world the quilters lived in. There are patterns named for the natural world: bear's paw, flying geese, maple leaf, ocean waves, Prairie Queen, Wild Goose Chase. These names speak of a life lived in close contact with the land and its creatures, of women who looked up from their work and saw the Canada geese moving across the autumn sky and found in the shape of their formation something worth preserving in fabric. There are patterns named for the domestic world: churn dash, monkey wrench, bow tie, grandmother's flower basket, log cabin. These names root the quilt firmly in the physical reality of the household, in the tools and objects and relationships that structured daily life. There are patterns named for faith: Star of Bethlehem, Jacob's Ladder, Crown of Thorns, Joseph's Coat, Cathedral Windows. And there are patterns named for politics and history. Bear's Paw was also known in some communities as Hand of Friendship, and in others, in the years before the Civil War, it was said to mark a safe house on the Underground Railroad, the same shape, the same geometry, but the name changed with the context, and with the name, the meaning. The log cabin pattern deserves its own moment of attention, because it is one of the most widely made and most richly symbolic patterns in the entire American quilting tradition. The basic unit of the log cabin block is a small square at the center, surrounded by narrow strips of fabric, the logs, added in sequence around it, building outward in a spiral. The center square was traditionally red or yellow, representing the fire or the light at the heart of the home. The strips surrounding it were divided into light fabrics on two sides and dark fabrics on the other two sides, representing the light side and the shadow side of the cabin, the sunlit face and the sheltered face. This division of light and dark gave the quilt its drama. When log cabin blocks were set together in different arrangements, the patterns of light and dark created dazzling secondary designs. Straight furrow, barn raising, sunshine, and shadow. These were the names given to the different settings, and each one created an entirely different visual effect from exactly the same basic block. The log cabin pattern emerged prominently in the 1860s, in the years of the Civil War, and its symbolism in that moment was not subtle. The log cabin was Abraham Lincoln's origin story, the symbol of frontier virtue and democratic possibility, the image of a country that believed a man could be born in the humblest circumstances and rise to the highest office. Making a log cabin quilt in those years was a statement, a declaration of values, a patriotic act stitched in fabric. Women on both sides of the conflict made quilts, and the log cabin pattern appears in quilts from both the North and the South, which tells you something interesting about the way symbols work, about how the same image can be claimed by people who mean very different things by it. How meaning is never entirely fixed, never entirely controlled by any single maker or community. Grief, in the vocabulary of American quilting, had its own particular grammar. The mourning quilt, made in the aftermath of a death, from fabric associated with the person who had died, is one of the most moving and most distinctly human expressions in the entire tradition. When a husband died, his wife might carefully cut pieces from his clothing, his Sunday coat, his work shirts, the vest he had worn to their wedding, and piece them into a quilt that would cover her bed for the rest of her life. This was not morbid. It was a way of managing grief through the hands, a way of transforming loss into something that could be held and used and kept close. The quilt was a continuing relationship with the person who was gone. It was a way of saying that the fabric of a life did not simply disappear when the life ended, that something of the person persisted in the things they had touched and worn and moved through the world in. The colors of mourning quilts followed the conventions of Victorian mourning culture: black and gray and deep purple, the colors of formal grief, arranged in patterns that were often simpler and more solemn than the exuberant designs of everyday quilts. But within those conventions there was still expression. A mourning quilt for a child might include touches of white, for innocence. A mourning quilt, made by an entire community for a beloved minister or teacher, might include blocks contributed by many hands, each one slightly different, the variation itself a kind of testament to the many lives the person had touched. The crazy quilt, that exuberantly irregular Victorian form in which pieces of irregular shapes and varied rich fabrics were stitched together with elaborate embroidery, was often a vehicle for mourning. The elaborate embroidered motifs that Decorated, each piece sometimes included memorial inscriptions, dates, the names of the dead. Faith moved through quilt patterns in ways both obvious and subtle. The explicitly religious patterns: Star of Bethlehem, Crown of Thorns, Jacob's Ladder, the aptly named cathedral windows with its curved piecing that caught and filtered light the way colored glass does. These were conscious expressions of religious identity, made by women for whom faith was not a private matter but the central organizing principle of community life. A Star of Bethlehem quilt, with its great 8-pointed star radiating from the center of the bed top, could be 6 feet across and pieced from hundreds of small diamond-shaped pieces in carefully graduated colors that created the illusion of light emanating from the center. Making such a quilt required months of work and extraordinary precision. The diamonds had to be cut and sewn with great accuracy, or the star would not lie flat. The discipline of the work was itself an expression of devotion. The patience required was a kind of prayer. Jacob's Ladder is a pattern of alternating squares and half-square triangles arranged in diagonal chains that move across the quilt surface like steps ascending. In some communities it was also known as Underground Railroad, and the double name is suggestive. The image of a ladder reaching toward heaven and the image of a path toward freedom share a common grammar of ascent, of movement from one state, of being to another, of the possibility of reaching somewhere better than where you are. Whether or not Jacob's Ladder quilts were literally used as signals in the Underground Railroad, the pattern's resonance in that context is real and deep. The language of faith and the language of liberation were not, for many Americans in the 19th century, separate languages. They were the same language, speaking the same truth in different registers. Courtship and marriage generated their own rich tradition of quilt patterns and quilt customs. In many communities, a young woman was expected to piece a certain number of quilt tops before she was considered ready for marriage. 12 was a common number, representing industry and domestic skill, and the practical provision of household necessities. The 13th quilt, the bridal quilt, was the special one, made with the best fabrics and the most intricate design, often helped along by friends and family at a special quilting bee held in honor of the engagement. The double wedding ring pattern, with its interlocking circles suggesting the rings exchanged at marriage and the endless looping continuity of a shared life, became one of the most beloved and most made patterns in the American tradition. Though interestingly, it did not become widely popular until the 20th century, when improved rotary cutting tools made the curved piecing it requires somewhat more manageable. Older courtship patterns included the double Irish chain, a pattern of interlocking diagonal chains that suggested the intertwining of two lives, and the bear's paw, which in some communities was called the hand of friendship, and was given to a young man setting off to make his own way in the world, a pattern of connection, of the reaching out of one hand toward another. The giving of quilts in courtship was a serious matter. A young woman who made a quilt for a young man was saying something definite with her hands. The hours of labor that went into a quilt were a form of declaration. This person is worth my time, my skill, my care. To receive such a quilt was to receive something that could not be lightly dismissed or easily returned. Community pride expressed itself in quilts in ways that were sometimes intimate and sometimes grandly public. The album quilt, also called the friendship quilt or the presentation quilt, was a form in which each block was made by a different person and signed, embroidered or inked with the maker's name, sometimes with a verse or a sentiment or a date. These quilts were made to be given to people who were leaving, a minister moving to a new congregation, a family emigrating west, a beloved teacher retiring, and they were physical embodiments of community, each block a different handwriting, a different skill level, a different expression of the same affection and regard. To receive an album quilt was to receive the community itself, carried in portable form, to be unfolded and looked at in the new place, each block a face, each signature a voice saying I was here, we were together, you were known and loved among us. At the Baltimore album quilts of the 1840s and 1850s represent perhaps the most spectacular flowering of this form, made in and around Baltimore, Maryland by quilters who were working at the absolute peak of the technical possibilities of their craft. These quilts feature appliqued blocks of extraordinary complexity and beauty, elaborate floral bouquets, patriotic eagles, cornucopias overflowing with fruit, architectural monuments, ships in full sail. The fabrics used were the finest available, the workmanship was breathtaking, and the overall effect of a full Baltimore album quilt, with its 16 or 25 blocks each a different composition, each a small masterwork of design and execution, is simply staggering. These quilts were made to impress, to demonstrate, to say something definite about the skill and taste and prosperity of the community that produced them. They were competitive objects in the best sense. They raised the standard. They inspired emulation. They said this is what we are capable of. And yet even within that grandeur the individual voice spoke. Each block in a Baltimore album quilt was made by a different woman, and each woman made her choices. This flower rather than that one, this arrangement of colors, this particular way of turning a leaf or shading a petal. The quilt as a whole was a community statement. Each block within it was a personal one. The tension between those two things, the individual and the community, the personal voice and the shared language, is one of the animating tensions of the entire American quilting tradition, and it is never fully resolved. And that irresolution is part of what makes the tradition so alive, so endlessly varied, so capable of continuing to generate new meaning even after 200 years. To look at a quilt pattern, then, is to look at a kind of compressed history, the choices made in that pattern, the name given to it, the colors chosen, the fabric selected, the scale at which it was worked, the occasion for which it was made. All of these things carry information about the world the maker lived in and the things she wanted to say and the community she was speaking to. The pattern is never just a pattern. It is never merely the arrangement of shapes on a surface. It is a language, and like all languages, it is alive. And like all languages, it changes as the people who speak it change. And like all languages, it carries within it the long memory of everything that has ever been said in it before. When you look at a quilt, really look at it, not just glance at it as a decorative object, but actually attend to it. Follow the lines of its pattern, notice the colors and how they interact, read the name of the pattern if you know it, and let that name open into its history. You are doing something that the women who made it would have understood immediately. You are reading. You are receiving a message that was stitched into fabric by hands that understood that cloth could carry meaning as surely as paper could, that a pattern repeated across a bedtop could say things about grief and faith and love, and pride and resistance and hope that words might not be adequate to hold. The message is still there. The patterns are still speaking. All you have to do is be still enough and quiet enough to hear them. Let the patterns blur softly now. Let the colors fade to warmth. You are held inside something made with care. There are stories that live in the space between what can be proven and what must be true. Stories that the official record cannot confirm but cannot quite dismiss either, because they are rooted in a reality so well documented, so thoroughly established, that the stories themselves feel less like invention and more like the natural shape that truth takes when it has been forced underground, when it has had to travel in secret, when it has learned to speak in code because speaking plainly was too dangerous. The story of the Underground Railroad quilts is one of these stories. It lives in that in-between space, and it has lived there for a long time, and the longer you sit with it, the longer you follow its threads back through history, through the testimony of descendants and the research of scholars and the weight of what we know about the lives of enslaved people in America. The more you begin to understand that whether or not every detail of the theory is precisely accurate, it is pointing at something real, something that happened, something that mattered. The Underground Railroad itself is not a theory. It is history, thoroughly documented, endlessly researched, the subject of memoirs and newspaper accounts and court records and the testimonies of the people who traveled it and the people who operated it. It was not, of course, a railroad in Thumb. There were no tracks, no stations, no trains. It was a network, a loose, decentralized, constantly shifting network of people, black and white, free and enslaved in the North and in the South and in the Miam, treacherous middle ground between them, who helped people escaping from slavery make their way to freedom. From the early decades of the 19th century through the Civil War, tens of thousands of people made this journey. They traveled at night, through swamps and forests and across rivers, following routes that were communicated by word of mouth, by trusted intermediaries, by a system of signals and safe houses and coded language that the network had developed. Out of pure necessity, they traveled under constant threat. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that even reaching the free states of the North was not enough. Freedom seekers could be captured and returned to enslavement even in Massachusetts, even in Ohio, even in cities where many people were actively opposed to slavery. The network had to operate in secret. It had to communicate without leaving records that could be seized or read by the wrong people. It had to develop a language that those who needed it could understand, and those who threatened it could not. Into this context comes the theory of the quilts. The theory, as it was articulated most fully and compellingly by Jacqueline Tobin and Raymond Dobard in their 1999 book Hidden in Plain View, goes something like this: that enslaved people, primarily enslaved women, developed a system of quilt patterns that could be used to communicate information to freedom seekers. That certain patterns hung over a fence or a porch railing or displayed in a window conveyed specific messages, that this was a safe house, that the route went in a certain direction, that certain landmarks should be followed, that danger was near, that the quilts, in other words, were maps, were signals, were a secret postal system written in fabric and hung in plain sight, where anyone could see them and only those who knew the code could read them. The patterns most commonly associated with this theory are ones we have already met in the general history of American quilt patterns, which is itself part of what makes the theory so compelling and so difficult to either fully confirm or fully dismiss. The bear's paw pattern, with its blocky shape suggesting the print of an animal in snow or mud, was said to indicate that freedom seekers should follow the trail of actual bear tracks, moving toward water and through the wilderness, rather than along roads where they might be seen. The flying geese pattern, with its rows of triangles suggesting birds in migration formation, was said to indicate direction. Follow the geese, which in spring fly north and in autumn fly south, follow their path toward freedom. The North Star pattern, a bold 8-pointed star design, was said to orient the traveler. Follow the star, move toward the light. The tumbling blocks pattern, a 3-dimensional optical illusion created by careful arrangement of diamond shapes, in 3 tones, was said to signal that the route had multiple levels, multiple possibilities, that the path was not straightforward and required careful navigation. The bow tie pattern was said to indicate that freedom seekers should dress as free people if possible, to disguise themselves in the clothing of their destination rather than their origin. The log cabin pattern, with its center square of red or yellow representing the fire at the heart of the home. A red center, according to some accounts, meant that the house displaying the quilt was a safe house, a place where the fire of freedom burned. These associations are evocative. They have the feeling of truth, not the feeling of something invented, but the feeling of something remembered, something passed down through generations in the oral tradition that Black American communities maintained with great care because the written record was so often closed to them. Jacqueline Tobin first encountered the theory from an African-American quilter named Ozella McDaniel Williams, whom she met in a Charleston, South Carolina market in the early 1990s. Williams told Tobin that the knowledge had been passed down, through her family, that her ancestors had used quilts to communicate along the Underground Railroad, that the patterns were a code and the code was real. She was insistent and specific, and Tobin, a writer and researcher, was compelled enough by what she heard to spend years investigating it. The research that Tobin and Dobard produced is genuinely valuable, regardless of where you ultimately come down on the question of the code's literal accuracy. It documents the rich tradition of African textile arts and their continuation in enslaved communities in America. It traces the symbolism of certain geometric patterns back to West and Central African visual traditions, the cosmogram of the Iwa Bakongo people, for instance, which uses a cross within a circle to represent the cycle of life and the relationship between the living and the dead, appears in certain quilt designs in ways that suggest cultural continuity rather than coincidence. It explores the way that enslaved people maintained and transmitted cultural knowledge under conditions designed to destroy it, and it argues, persuasively and movingly, that the quilt was one of the vessels in which that knowledge traveled. The EU scholarly criticism of the specific code theory is also genuine and should be engaged with honestly. Historians, including Giles Wright, a researcher who conducted an extensive investigation of the theory for the New Jersey Historical Commission, have pointed out that there is no contemporaneous written evidence for the use of quilt codes. No diary, no letter, no newspaper account, no memoir from the period of the Underground Railroad that specifically describes quilts being used as signals. The accounts that do exist are all retrospective, all passed through generations of oral transmission before being recorded. Wright and others argued that the specific pattern to message correspondences described in the theory, bear's paw, means follow the bear tracks. Flying geese means follow the migration routes, are too precise and too uniform to be plausible as a widespread secret communication system. A code that is shared widely enough to be useful is a code that is at serious risk of being discovered, and a discovered code would have put enormous numbers of people in terrible danger. These are serious objections, and they deserve to be taken seriously. But there is a counter-argument, and it is not a weak one. The absence of written evidence for the quilt code is not evidence of its absence. The entire point of the Underground Railroad was that it left as little written record as possible. Harriet Tubman, who made 19 missions into slave territory and guided approximately 70 people to freedom, was famously careful about what she allowed to be written down about her routes and methods. The people who operated safe houses destroyed correspondence. The freedom seekers themselves often could not read or write. The network was designed to be undocumented because documentation was danger. To look for contemporaneous written records of a deliberately unwritten communication system and conclude, from their absence, that the system did not exist is a logical error. The silence proves nothing in either direction. What the silence does instead is return us to the oral tradition, to the testimonies of descendants like Ozella McDaniel Williams, to the accounts collected by researchers and folklorists and oral historians in the 20th century from elderly Black Americans who said their grandparents had told them about the quilts. These testimonies are not uniform. They do not all agree on the specific patterns or the specific meanings. Some describe a much more general use of quilts as safe house signals, simply that a quilt hung on a fence or a line meant that the house was safe, without the elaborate pattern-specific code that the theory sometimes implies. This simpler version of the story is in some ways more historically plausible, and it is also documented. There are accounts, from the period of the railroad and from later oral histories, of quilts and other textiles being used as general signals. A candle in a certain window, a particular arrangement of objects on a porch. These kinds of environmental signals were genuinely used by the railroad network. What seems most likely, if you sit with all of the available evidence and try to hold it without forcing it into a shape it doesn't quite fit, is something like this: that quilts were used in various ways, by various people in various communities, to communicate various things related to the Underground Railroad, and that the specific patterns mattered in some of these uses, and that the oral tradition of this use was real and was preserved and transmitted through generations of Black American families, that the code, as it has been described in its most systematic and uniform version, may be somewhat more organized in retrospect than it was in practice, that the oral tradition has consolidated and systematized what was in reality a more varied and locally specific set of practices. This would not make the tradition false. It would make it what oral traditions almost always are, an attempt by a community to preserve the essential truth of something that happened, in a form, that can be carried forward through time without the support of written records. And the essential truth is real. Enslaved people were extraordinarily creative and resourceful in finding ways to communicate, to navigate, to resist, and to survive. They developed elaborate systems of coded language, the spirituals, those magnificent songs that expressed religious feeling, and also, in their geography and their imagery of crossing rivers and reaching Canaan and following the drinking gourd, encoded information about routes and directions. They used the stars, particularly the North Star, which appears in countless spirituals and testimonies as the great orienting light of the freedom journey. They rid the landscape with a precision born of necessity, navigating by waterways and tree lines and the patterns of moss on bark. They passed information through networks of trust built over years, through the church, through the community of the quarters, through the gatherings that the enslaving class sometimes permitted because they seemed harmless, the corn huskings, and the prayer meetings and the quilting bees. That quilts were part of this world of coded communication seems, in this larger context, not merely plausible but almost inevitable. The quilt was already a community object, already made in gathering, already understood by those who made it as something that carried meaning beyond its material function. The tradition of meaning in quilt patterns, the shared visual vocabulary that we explored in the previous chapter, was already established, already understood, already operating as a form of communication that community members could read and outsiders might not. To extend that vocabulary into the service of the most urgent communication imaginable, "You are safe here, go this way, danger ahead, follow the star," required no fundamental leap. It required only the application of an existing language to a new and desperate purpose. Harriet Tubman, who is the great human center of the Underground Railroad story, never, in any recorded account, specifically mentioned quilts as part of her navigation system. She spoke of the North Star, of the rivers, of her absolute trust in the guidance of God, of the network of people who sheltered and fed and guided her and those she led. But Tubman was also famously protective of her methods and her routes and the people who helped her. She did not tell everything she knew to anyone who asked. The absence of quilts in her recorded testimony is not, cannot be, the end of the question. What we are left with, finally, is the quilts themselves. The ones that survive from the period, made by enslaved and free black women in the South and the North, stitched in the patterns that the theory identifies. When you look at a bear's paw quilt made by an enslaved woman in South Carolina in the 1840s, you cannot know with certainty what she intended by it. You cannot know if she hung it on a fence on a cold night and watched a group of freedom seekers read it and take their bearing from it and move on into the darkness toward something better. You cannot know if she was thinking, as she cut each blocky paw shape from her scraps of fabric, about the bears in the swamp country, and the paths they made, and the people who might follow those paths to freedom. But you can know that she was a human being living under conditions of extraordinary oppression and extraordinary danger, and that she found ways, as human beings always find ways, to resist and to help and to maintain her humanity and the humanity of those around her. You can know that the quilt she made was not just a quilt. You can know that the tradition she was part of was rich and deliberate and full of meaning. You can know that the patterns she chose were not random, that nothing in her life was random, that every choice she made was weighted with awareness and intention, and the knowledge that the world she lived in required her to speak carefully, to mean more than she said, to hide the most important truths in plain sight. The quilts of the Underground Railroad, whatever their precise role in that network, are part of this larger truth. They are evidence of a people who could not be silenced, who found in fabric and pattern and the slow work of the needle a language capacious enough to hold both beauty and resistance, both the daily reality of their lives and the enormous dream of freedom. They stitched that dream into cloth, they hung it where it could be seen, and somewhere in the darkness someone saw it and understood, and kept moving toward the light. Let the stars be visible tonight. Let the path be clear. You are moving gently toward rest. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to waiting. Not the sharp, immediate grief of the moment when the news arrives. That grief is its own terrible thing, sudden and total. The world reorganizing itself around an absence that wasn't there a moment ago. But the grief of waiting is different. It is the grief that lives in the body of a woman standing at a window in the early morning, looking down a road that her husband walked away on 6 months ago, listening for something she cannot name. It is the grief of not knowing, of writing letters that may or may not arrive, of reading casualty lists in the newspaper with a particular quality of dread that you carry constantly, like a stone in the chest, like a held breath that goes on for months and then for years. This was the grief of the Civil War for the women who stayed behind. And it was into this grief, this particular, prolonged, uncertain, devastating form of human suffering, that they stitched their quilts. The Civil War was the most destructive conflict in American history, and its destructiveness was not limited to the battlefields where 600,000 men died. It reached into every household in the country, north and south, and it rearranged the interior landscape of American life in ways that took generations to fully reckon with. For women, the war created a new and terrible kind of solitude. The men left, husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, and the women remained, and in remaining they had to carry everything: the farm, the children, the household, the business, the community. All of it fell to women who had been prepared, by their upbringing and their culture, for a supporting role, and who found themselves suddenly, without preparation or ceremony, holding the whole weight of daily life on their own. And in the evenings, when the children were finally asleep and the day's work was as done as it was going to be and the house was quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet when someone who should be in them is not, they sat down with their fabric and their needles and they made quilts. The quilts made during the Civil War years, roughly 1861 through 1865, and in the decade or so immediately following, constitute one of the most remarkable and most moving bodies of work in the entire history of American quilting. They are remarkable for their quantity. Women on both sides of the conflict made quilts in enormous numbers, both for personal use and for donation to soldiers through the network of aid societies and sanitary commissions that sprang up across the North and in more limited form across the South. They are remarkable for their variety, from the humblest utility quilts pieced from any available fabric and intended simply to keep a wounded soldier warm, to the most elaborate and carefully designed presentation quilts made for officers or for fundraising purposes, and they are remarkable most of all for what they carry: the full emotional weight of the war, the grief and the hope and the patriotism and the fear and the love, all of it pressed into cloth, all of it stitched, through with a needle moving in and out, in the rhythm that women had always used to manage what was otherwise unmanageable. The Sanitary Commission, established in 1861 to coordinate the provision of medical and other supplies to Union soldiers, became one of the largest voluntary organizations in American history, and women were its engine. They organized locally into thousands of ladies' aid societies, which collected and made and shipped an almost incomprehensible quantity of material to the front: bandages, clothing, food, medicine, and quilts. Hundreds of thousands of quilts. The records of the Sanitary Commission document quilts arriving from small towns in Vermont and farming communities in Indiana and church groups in Ohio. Quilts made by women who had never met a soldier from another state and who nonetheless felt the pull of obligation, the sense that their hands could do something useful in a war where their hands were the only contribution they were permitted to make. Many of these donation quilts were simple. They were made quickly, from whatever fabric was at hand, in patterns that could be pieced efficiently without elaborate templates or precise cutting. The 9-patch, 9 squares arranged in a 3x3 grid alternating between a light fabric and a dark one, could be made very fast, and 9-patch quilts left the home front for military hospitals by the thousands. But simplicity of design did not mean absence of feeling. Women signing their names and home addresses to the quilts they donated, a common practice, in the hope that a soldier might write back, might establish a correspondence, might be comforted by the knowledge that a specific woman in a specific place had made this specific thing for him, were putting themselves into the quilts as surely as if they had written letters. Some correspondences did begin this way. Some of them became courtships. Some of them, in the cruel arithmetic of the war, were ended by a casualty list before they had really begun. The women of the South faced the additional challenge of material scarcity. The Union blockade of southern ports cut off the supply of imported cloth, and as the war ground on, fabric became desperately precious in Confederate states in a way that recalled the scarcity of the colonial period. Women unpicked old quilts and remade them. They used feed sacks and flour bags, dyed with whatever plant materials were at hand: walnut hulls for brown, indigo for blue where it could be obtained, oak bark for tan, pokeweed berries for a fugitive reddish-purple that rarely held its color for long. The quilts made in the South during the war years often have a characteristic palette, muted, earthy, improvised, that tells you immediately something about the conditions under which they were made. And they were made under conditions, a fear that Northern women, for all their anguish, did not share in the same way. The war came to the South in a physical sense that it never came to most of the North. Women in Virginia and Georgia and Tennessee made their quilts with the sound of artillery sometimes audible in the distance, with the knowledge that the landscape outside their windows might by tomorrow belong to an invading army. The pattern, known as shoe fly, a simple block of a center square surrounded by triangles and corner squares, was made across the country during the war years, and its name carried a grim joke: shoe fly, drive away the trouble, drive away the thing that plagues you. The Burgoyne-surrounded pattern, which dates to the Revolutionary War but was revived during the Civil War years, showed a complex arrangement of small squares suggesting an army encircled and captured. Women who chose this pattern for their wartime quilts were making a statement about how they expected the conflict to end. The Union Star, the Confederate Rose. The war entered the vocabulary of quilt patterns and stayed there, adding new layers of meaning to designs that already had histories, or generating new patterns that crystallize the specific emotional moment of the conflict. But it is in the mourning quilts of the Civil War period that you find the most direct and most intimate record of what the war cost. When the news came, and it came so often, came to so many households, came in the form of a letter from an officer or a chaplain or a fellow soldier, or in the columns of the newspaper, or sometimes in the terrible efficiency of a telegram, the women who received it had to find somewhere to put what they felt. The culture gave them mourning rituals, a whole elaborate Victorian grammar of grief, the black dresses and the black bordered stationery and the hairwork jewelry made from the hair of the dead and the prescribed periods of withdrawal from social life, and it gave them the needle and thread. A widow making a mourning quilt from her husband's clothing was doing something that had no adequate description in the language of the time, something that still resists easy description now. She was continuing her relationship with him through the only means still available to her. The cloth had touched his body. It carried, in some sense that is not quite rational and not quite irrational, something of him. To cut it and piece it and stitch it into a form that would cover her bed, that she would sleep under for the rest of her life. This was an act of love that was also an act of transformation. It took the raw material of loss and made it into something that could be lived with, something that could keep her warm. The fabrics in Civil War mourning quilts tell stories that the women who made them rarely wrote down. The rough wool of a Union Army uniform, cut into squares and alternated with pieces of a white cotton shirt. The fine broadcloth of a Sunday coat, the coat a man had been married in perhaps, now pieced alongside the faded calico of a house dress, worn until it could be worn no longer. The colors of these quilts are often dark, the deep navy of military wool, the black and gray and purple of Victorian mourning convention, but not always. Some Civil War mourning quilts are made in the full range of whatever fabrics were available, because the woman making them had no choice, because she had given everything she had to the making of donation quilts and the support of the war effort, and what was left for her own grief was whatever remained in the scrap basket. The improvisation of those quilts is itself a kind of testimony. The memory quilts of the period extended beyond individual mourning into communal commemoration. Churches and ladies' aid societies made quilts that recorded the names of the men from their community who had served and died, names embroidered in careful stitches block by block, the quilt becoming a textile roll of honor, a fabric memorial. These quilts were displayed in churches and public buildings, handled and looked at and pointed to by people who recognized the names, who could say that block there, that one with the name in blue thread. That was my cousin. That was my neighbor's. Boy, he was 17 when he enlisted and he died at Chancellorsville, and his mother never recovered from it. There is a quilt in the collection of the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, or there was, before the institution's rebranding and reorganization, that is made entirely of silk ribbons from the uniforms of Confederate officers, stitched together by the women of a Richmond family into a quilt that is both a record of military service and an object of devastating beauty. The silks are deep red and gold and gray, the colors of ceremony and rank, and they are cut into strips and pieced together with a care that speaks of hours spent in a particular quality of attention, of hands that needed to be doing something, and chose to do something beautiful with what the war had left them. Hope in the Civil War quilts is harder to find than grief, but it is there. It is there in the donation quilts, which were themselves an act of faith, the faith that the soldier who received the quilt would survive to be warm in it, that the war would end, that the men would come home. It is there in the quilts made for hope chests during the war years, by young women who refused to stop believing that there would be marriages and households and futures worth preparing for. It is there in the album quilts made by communities to present to returning soldiers, the blocks signed and dated, the sentiments embroidered, the whole thing a communal embrace in fabric, a welcome home stitched by many hands, and it is there, quietly and persistently, in the choice to keep making. To keep sitting down in the evening with the fabric and the needle and the thread and to make something that was whole and ordered and beautiful in the middle of a world that was being torn apart. There is a kind of hope in that act that does not require a name and does not require a future to be sure of. It is the hope that is simply the refusal to stop, the insistence that the hands can still make something, that the pattern can still be followed, that the pieces, however fragmentary and however strange their origins, can still be brought together into something that holds. After the war, the quilts continued. They continued because grief does not end when the conflict does, because a generation of women was left with absences that would never be filled, because the work of making had become in those years of waiting a necessary practice that could not simply be set aside when the waiting was over. The mourning quilts of the late 1860s and 1870s are some of the most elaborate ever made. The crazy quilt form, with its irregular pieces of silk and velvet and brocade stitched together with elaborate embroidery, became the dominant quilt style of the Gilded Age, and part of its appeal was surely the way it allowed for the expression of complexity, of irresolution, of a world that did not fit together in neat geometric regularity anymore. The crazy quilt looked the way the post-war world felt, fragmentary, irregular, gorgeous in places and ragged in others, holding together by the force of the stitching alone. The embroidered motifs that decorated crazy quilt patches in this period form their own catalog of post-war feeling. Spiderwebs, which were said to bring good luck. Horseshoes and fans and flowers, the conventional symbols of Victorian decorative art. And also, again and again, the motifs of memory, dates embroidered in silk thread, initials that might have stood for the living or the dead. Small representational images whose personal significance died with the maker and can no longer be decoded. These quilts are full of private language, of meaning that was never meant to be explained because it was made for the maker herself, made to hold what she needed to hold, made to give form to what otherwise had no form. To hold a Civil War quilt, to actually hold one, feel its weight, look at the fabrics and the stitching and the choices made in every block and border, is to hold a record of something that no official history quite captures. Not the military history, the campaigns and the commanders and the turning points that are in all the books, but the other history, the interior history, the history of what it cost and what it meant and how people found ways to live inside it, and through it and somehow out the other side. The women who made these quilts were not writing history. They were not thinking of themselves as historical actors. They were sitting in their houses in the evening, doing the thing their hands knew how to do, trying to manage what life had given them to manage. But they left a record. It is stitched into cloth, preserved in museums and private collections and attics and church basements across the country. It is faded and fragile, and in some cases barely holding together. The old threads giving way, the old fabrics thinning to transparency, but it is there. The record of the grief is there, and the record of the hope is there, and the record of the making, the insistence on making, the refusal to stop, is there in every stitch. Let the old grief rest now. Let the thread go still, and the fabric fold into warmth. You are held across all the distance of time by hands that made something from whatever they had. Every living tradition has a moment when the world looks away. When the thing that had been central becomes peripheral, when the knowledge that passed so naturally from hand to hand begins to skip a generation, when the objects that were once made in every household begin instead to be found only in the homes of the very old, or in museum cases behind glass, or in antique shops where they carry price tags that would have astonished the women who made them. This is not death. It only looks like death from the outside. From the inside, from within the tradition itself, it is more like a long breath held, a period of waiting, of compression, of the knowledge and the skill and the meaning contracting into a smaller number of keepers, held more tightly precisely because there are fewer hands to hold it. And then something shifts. The world turns back. The breath releases. And what looked like an ending reveals itself to have been, all along, a gathering of force. American quilting held its breath through the middle decades of the 20th century. Not entirely. It never disappeared entirely because it is not the kind of thing that can disappear entirely, rooted as it is in something too fundamental about human making and human connection to be fully displaced by any amount of modernity. Women continued to quilt through the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, in rural communities especially, in church groups and family traditions, in the hands of grandmothers who had learned from their grandmothers and who kept the knowledge alive the way all knowledge is ultimately kept alive, by practicing it, by teaching it, by refusing to let it go unshared. But the cultural prestige of quilting, the sense that it was a living and vital and contemporary art form rather than a charming relic of a simpler past, had diminished considerably. The Industrial Revolution had done what it always does. It had made the handmade seem unnecessary, had replaced the long labor of the needle with the quick efficiency of the machine, had transformed fabric from a precious resource to be carefully husbanded into a cheap commodity to be freely consumed and discarded. The 1930s had actually brought a brief, intense revival of quilting interest, driven partly by the economic devastation of the Depression, which made the old logic of thrift and reuse suddenly relevant again, and partly by a wave of nostalgia for a simpler, more self-sufficient American past that the Depression made people hunger for. Quilt patterns were published in newspapers and magazines in enormous numbers during this period. Kits were sold, with fabric pre-cut and patterns printed, making quilting accessible to women who had not learned the traditional skills. Some of the most beloved and most widely recognized American quilt patterns, the double wedding ring, the Dresden plate, became popular primarily during this period, their curved piecing and pastel colors perfectly suited to the Depression-era aesthetic of modest prettiness, of making something lovely from very little. But the 1930s revival, real as it was, did not fully restore quilting to the center of American cultural life. The post-war years brought prosperity and a new relationship with the domestic. The gleaming, modern, efficient post-war home was not a place that obviously called for the slow, handmade, accumulated aesthetic of the quilt. Synthetic fabrics and electric blankets and centrally heated houses made the utilitarian argument for quilting obsolete. And the post-war culture of femininity, with its emphasis on the housewife as consumer and manager rather than maker, left less room for the kind of extended, skilled, patient handwork that serious quilting required. Quilting retreated further into the margins, into the rural, the elderly, the deliberately traditional, and the mainstream looked elsewhere. And then came the 1970s, and everything changed. To understand what happened to quilting in the 1970s, you have to understand what was happening in America more broadly, because the quilting revival of that decade was not separate from the cultural upheaval of the period. It was an expression of it, a product of it, one of its most distinctive and enduring artifacts. The 1970s were a decade of questioning, of Americans, and particularly American women, asking fundamental questions about the values and the structures and the stories they had inherited, turning them over, looking at what was underneath, deciding what to keep and what to discard and what to reclaim. The women's movement was reshaping the understanding of what women's lives could and should be. The counterculture, moving into its more settled and domestically focused phase after the intensity of the late 1960s, was generating a widespread interest in craft, in handmaking, in the recovery of skills and practices that industrial modernity had displaced. Back to the land, back to the hands, back to the making of things. Into this moment, quilting arrived like something that had been waiting off stage for exactly this cue. It had everything the moment was looking for. It was a women's tradition, created by women and passed down through women and embedded in women's community life. At a moment when feminism was insisting on the value and the dignity of women's experience, here was an entire art form that had always been women's, that had been dismissed as craft precisely because it was women's, that deserved to be recognized as the genuine artistic achievement it was. It was a tradition of community and collaboration. At a moment when the alienation of modern life was being widely diagnosed and the hunger for genuine human connection was intense, here was a practice that had always been organized around gathering, around the bee, around the frame that required many hands. It was a tradition of thrift and resourcefulness and the transformation of humble materials into beauty. At a moment when the environmental movement was beginning to articulate a critique of consumer culture and its wastefulness, here was an art form whose entire aesthetic was built on the refusal to waste. The signal event, the moment that is most often identified as the catalyst for the quilting revival, was an exhibition that opened in 1971 at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. The exhibition was called Abstract Design in American Quilts, and it was organized by Jonathan Holstein and Gail Vander Hoof, collectors who had begun acquiring antique American quilts and who had noticed something that the craft world had not yet fully articulated, that these quilts, when you looked at them as visual objects rather than as domestic artifacts, were doing something extraordinarily sophisticated. That the bold geometric patterns, the high contrast colors, the dynamic use of positive and negative space, the optical effects created by the repetition and variation of simple shapes, all of this was not just decorative, not just the charming product of untrained folk instinct. It was art. It was doing what the great abstract painters of the 20th century, Mondrian, Albers, the color field painters, were doing, and in some cases it had been doing it a century before they were born. The Whitney show was a revelation. It was reviewed in the art press and the general press. It generated a conversation about the relationship between fine art and craft, between the gallery and the household, between the trained artist and the unnamed woman who had pieced a nine-patch or a bear's paw by firelight in 1860 and produced something that could hold its own, visually and intellectually, against anything hanging on the walls around it. The show did not resolve that conversation. It opened it. And the conversation has been ongoing ever since, sometimes heated, sometimes productive, always revealing something important about the ways in which culture decides what counts as art and who gets to make it. For women across America who saw the exhibition or read about it or felt its effects ripple outward through the culture, something clicked into place. The thing their grandmothers had done, the thing they had perhaps learned as children and then set aside as they moved into the modern world, the thing that had seemed old-fashioned and quaint and domestic in all the limiting senses of that word, that thing was art, had always been art, had been art all along without anyone in the official art world having the generosity or the perceptiveness to say so. And the recognition was not just aesthetic, it was political. It was the recognition that women's work, the work done in the home, in the margins without pay or prestige or public acknowledgement, had value. Had always had value, that the dismissal of quilting as mere craft was of a piece with the dismissal of women's lives more generally, and that reclaiming quilting was, in a real and meaningful sense, reclaiming something larger. Women began to quilt, in enormous numbers, with enormous energy, with the particular intensity of people who feel they have recovered something that was wrongly taken from them. Quilting guilds formed in cities where there had been none before. Not just in the rural communities where the tradition had continued quietly, but in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and Boston, in universities and art schools and community centers. Classes were offered and attended. Books were published. The 1970s produced more books on quilting than any previous decade in American history, books that addressed both the historical tradition and the contemporary revival. Books written by artists and by scholars and by practitioners who were sometimes all three at once. Quilt shows multiplied. The American Quilters Society, the National Quilting Association, and dozens of regional and local organizations were founded or dramatically expanded during this period, creating the institutional infrastructure of a living art form rather than a dying craft. The quilts made in the 1970s revival were not simply reproductions of historical patterns. They were new things, made by people who had absorbed the history and were doing something with it, extending it, questioning it, pushing against its edges. Artists trained in the fine art tradition began making quilts, bringing to the form a set of concerns and techniques that the traditional quilt world had not previously engaged with. Miriam Shapiro, a feminist artist whose work would come to define the pattern and decoration movement, made large-scale works she called femiges, collages and constructions that incorporated fabric, lace, and quilted elements, claiming the materials and methods of women's traditional work for the gallery wall. Faith Ringgold began making story quilts, quilts in which painted imagery and written text were combined with the quilted surface to create narrative works of extraordinary power and beauty, works that told the stories of Black American life and history and imagination in a form that drew on both the African American quilting tradition and the conventions of contemporary art. Ringgold's story quilts deserve particular attention because they represent perhaps the most complete realization of the quilting revival's deepest aspiration, the integration of the traditional and the contemporary, the craft and the fine art, the community, and the individual voice. Her Tarbeach, which depicts a young black girl lying on the rooftop of her Harlem apartment building, looking up at the stars and dreaming of flight, is surrounded by a border of patterned fabric that places it unmistakably within the quilting tradition, even as the painted central image and the handwritten text claim the vocabulary of narrative art. The quilt is both things at once, a story and a quilt, a painting and a textile, an individual artwork and a communal object. It won a Caldecott honor when it was adapted into a picture book, and it hangs in museum collections, and it is also, unmistakably, a quilt. The political dimension of the revival found its most powerful expression in the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which was conceived in 1985 by activist Cleve Jones and first displayed on the National Mall in Washington in 1987. The quilt, it is often written with a capital Q, as though it is a proper noun, which it has become, consists of individual panels, each 3 feet by 6 feet, the size of a human grave, each made by the loved ones of someone who died of AIDS. By the time of its first display, it contained nearly 2,000 panels. By the early 1990s, it had grown to tens of thousands. It is now the largest piece of community folk art in the world, and it is a quilt in both the literal and the deepest metaphorical sense, a piecing together of fragments, each one distinct, each one a voice, each one representing a specific human life, all of them held together by the shared structure of the whole. The AIDS quilt drew directly on the American quilting tradition, on the memorial quilts of the Civil War era, on the album quilts made by communities to honor and remember their members, on the understanding, woven through the entire history of American quilting, that the stitched object can carry grief and love in ways that other forms cannot. And it demonstrated, to a generation that had perhaps not fully understood this, that quilting was not a quaint domestic pastime but a living and vital and politically serious art form, capable of responding to the most urgent human crises with a dignity and a power that had no equivalent in any other medium. The revival that began in the 1970s never ended. It transformed into something broader and more varied and more complex, something that is now simply the living state of American quilting in the 21st century. The tradition is larger now than it has ever been in terms of the number of practitioners, the range of techniques and styles, the diversity of the people who engage with it. Men quilt. Young people quilt. Artists with MFAs quilt alongside grandmothers who learned from their grandmothers. The internet has created communities of quilters that span the globe, sharing patterns and techniques and finished work in ways that the women of the quilting bee could not have imagined and might have recognized immediately. The same impulse, the same hunger for connection and conversation and the shared pleasure of making, translated into a new medium. And through all of it, the old tradition persists. The patterns with their beautiful, strange names, the rhythm of the needle moving, in and out, the gathering of the pieces, each one a remnant of something that had another life before this one, each one brought together with the others into something whole and warm and made with care. The quilt on the bed, the quilt on the wall, the quilt folded in the cedar chest and brought out for the grandchildren, the quilt that someone is making right now, tonight, in a room somewhere, by lamplight, hands moving steadily, the thread pulling through, it never truly left. It only waited, as living things sometimes must, for the world to remember what it had always known, that the making of something beautiful from the fragments of ordinary life is not a small thing. It is not a lesser thing. It is, in fact, one of the most human things there is. And the tradition that understood this, that has always understood this, that stitched this understanding into cloth for 200 years and more, that tradition is not finished. It is nowhere near finished. It is, if anything, only beginning. Let the last stitch rest. Let the needle be still. You have traveled a long way tonight, through 2 centuries of making and meaning and care. Now let yourself be covered, gently, in all of it. Sleep.